Here is a blue ink by Sailor Manyo Konagi.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
A vibrant blue that will not disappoint. It goes down darker, but after it dries, its lighter is still very vibrant. Again, you won't be disappointed, even with this being a lighter blue. It's got something really to it. There's almost no tone variation by nib, making it boring in all of the best ways. There is some slight shading, but it isn't a standout quality. It's very gentle in its execution. I do wish that it was a bit more pronounced, but what's there does fairly decent. I don't know that I've seen a light blue like this that comes across as vibrant as this one before, and it really makes it a standout different blue than any other one that I've used.
The pen for today is a Noodler's Nipponset. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine, that very first bit, the pen sat for a couple days before I used it, so that one was a bit darker, but we get a nice lighter blue. There's no feathering, there's no spread, there's subtle, really subtle shading that goes on. Look at knot. The T is just a little bit darker. Move, the E is quite a bit darker. It is much darker than what's around it. Though underneath, starch light gets dark at the HR, lightens up again until the final H. So the shading is definitely there and does a very nice job with it. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is very, very subtle shading, and you see it in buttons. Look at the second T compared to the first T. In wedge, look at the G compared to the E. On the third line, the starts lighter and works its way darker. The shading very, very subtle again, but really nice. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is the same subtle shading that went on. Look at into, the TO darker than the in. The is the dark tone the whole way through, where open starts lighter and becomes a little darker at the P and lightens up again at the EN. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone, just a little bit duller than it was on the Clairfontaine. Not something to be surprised about since it's not fountain pen friendly paper, or at least it's not made to be the fountain pen paper. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get little bits of shading. Look at from on the second line, starts a little darker, works its way a little bit lighter, where cloud on the third line is nice and it's got its darker tones, lightens up at the U and the beginning of the D and darkens up again at the end of the D. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine. just a tad bit lighter, I think, than on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. Yes, it still shades. Look at could on the second line, starting darker, becoming lighter, darker again at the end of the word. Even though this is a little bit lighter than what we're getting on the Clairfontaine, it's very... It's a flatter yet still vibrant color. Amazing, really. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as it was with the medium, just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with a few spots of shading. Look at should, the very first word, starts darker, works its way lighter at the OU, or it's shouted, not should. The TED, just a little bit darker, but look at the middle of that D. It lightens up a little bit. And shadow directly underneath it, darker, lightens up at the A, darkens again at the D, lightens up at the OW. Shading really very well, even though it's not in a huge standout kind of way. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, though we start to see this look a bit more like a turquoise because of the effect of the tone of the paper, meaning the ink is a little bit more translucent than opaque. Not a big deal. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It does have shading. I think the shading shows a little stronger here than it did. It shades just as well and just as often, but I think it shows stronger. Look at jumped, that P, much darker, into that T, jumps out. Terrific. Look at the F or the T of burst directly underneath it. The letters, when they're very dark, really do jump out from the rest of the word. Looking at the medium nib, it is right about the same tone that we had with the extra fine. Lighter in darkness than it was on the Clairfontaine, still really showing itself as a blue-leaning turquoise because of the paper, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading. You see it in leaping, quite, really dark at the beginning, lightens up at the IN, darkens up at the G, where coat starts light and works its way dark. Same thing happens with and right next to it, both on the first line. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as it was with the medium, bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, really showing off that turquoise lean as an effect of the paper. No feathering, no spread. Yes, it shades. Look at the D of doorstep, or the T or the P of doorstep. When it shades, it does really, really nice. It doesn't do it back and forth as much as I really do love seeing inks do it, but considering that the shading of this ink is, to me, not the standout quality, it's the vibrancy in the lighter blue tone, I'm going to say the shading I'm seeing here is really great. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it's the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine. The most noticeable thing is, because the lines, the vertical lines of this paper are also blue, and this being a bit lighter, the back vertical lines don't really disappear, making the quad rule has this look a little confusing there's a lot going on. No feather, no spread, shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. The on the second line starts lighter, gets much darker, where sun starts dark and works its way light. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading. The shading is still very gentle in how it's doing. Look at find on the first line. Starts lighter, becomes much darker at the D, and I say much darker as in with the shading that this particular ink is giving. Slipping on the second line does the same thing. Starts lighter, works its way darker at the P's. Now at the end to the G, it's lighter and then darkens up again at the G. Shadow starts dark and works its way light, as if it's melting into the shadows. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, still with shading, keeping it up, looking at keeping. Starts dark, lightens up at the I end, darkens up again at the G, where of on the first line starts lighter, works its way darker in the first part of the F, lightens up on the second part of the F. The right next to that, lighter to darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman, their number 3 Ackerman Blue. Here is Diatramentis 225th Constitution Anniversary. Here is Diamine Sapphire Blue. Here is Dr. P.H. Martin's Ocean Blue. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, much flatter as a tone. It really doesn't have the vibrancy. We're also seeing a little bit of that turquoise lean that this ink did show on the toned paper. No feathering, no spread. There is some shading. I want to say there's less shading than we've seen, but it's there. On escaped on the first line, you see it on the PED, where into on the second line, the T is quite a bit darker. The directly underneath that on the third line starts lighter and gets darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with very little shading. Now, at the very end of this, you're going to see where I went and fixed, because instead of putting behind, I put hehind, and had to change the H to a B, and when I went back over that, it darkened up quite a bit. Looking at the stub nib, it is only a little bit darker than we had with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get more shading than, we've really had here on this paper. It's doing a good job. Look at mountains on the first line. It's a very gentle starts lighter, into the NTA is a little bit darker and lightens up again. Across underneath that is, in general, a lighter word. But even as a lighter word, the AC is a little darker than the ROS, but the second S, a little bit darker. Where looked underneath that is darker as a word entirely. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a pink ink by J.R.R. Roule Dance. Here is an orange ink by Sailor Manyo. Here is a magenta ink by Noodler's Matahari Cordial. Here is a yellow ink by Diamine Amber. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering, there is spread, there is no shading, there is a loss of a good ink on crappy paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the extra fine. About the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine as far as darkness goes. We do get a lot of feathering. Lots of feathering. Welcome to the bird exhibit on 20-pound copy paper. There's spread to a bit more than a broad. The feathering in the spread I do find a bit distracting. It doesn't mean it'll be distracting for everybody, but look at exclaimed and the amount of feathering that's going on gives it kind of a blurry look. Not a fan. Yes, there is some shading happening. You see it in exclaimed on the X and L, and you see it on the T of got directly underneath it. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. Lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. Yes, it almost looks like I was writing with a felt tip pen. Yes, there's a few moments of shading. Look at right on the first line. It starts lighter and works its way darker. Not that I'm a fan of what I'm seeing at all. I think this is dreadful. Looking at the page underneath, we see that it was the stub that had the bleeding spots, and it really did have the most feathering. So the ink was really kind of flowing through the paper there. Looking at the back of the page, we know that we could not write back here, or we're going to destroy 2 sets of notes in one shot.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
It truly looks good in all the time, but to help the shading stand out a bit more, I go for a really wet stub. Now, this is based on my experience with the pen of the day, the Noodler's Neponset. Back in the beginning of the video on the Mnemosyne paper, you really see the shading standing out at its best. And that's why I can say that I go for a wet stub. However, that doesn't mean that you couldn't put this in any pen and be very happy with what you would get as a result. It's just about trying to choose that one that may be a bit better in what you're going to get. That's what I think the wet stub will do for you.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.